Welcome back to World Tonight. So we've already talked about arms deliveries to Ukraine from NATO perspective, from the Ukrainian perspective. Now let's focus on what Americans think about this issue.
So our guest is one Patsy Widakuswara, who is calling us from America. She is Voice of America White House Bureau Chief. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, my pleasure to be here.
Ms. Widakuswara, in our part of Europe, with the ending of the Prague summit, our eyes and minds are already on the Swiss peace talks, potential peace talk summit. With the notable absence, we already know that President Biden will not be there, or so he said. Do you think is there anything that would change his mind?
Well, so far what we are hearing is there is no plans for President Biden to go to Switzerland. And this is, quite interesting because he would already be in the area following the G7 summit in Bari, Switzerland. As far as I know, President Biden is the only G7 leader who will not be attending the summit in Switzerland after Bari. But so far, the White House has said there are no plans for Biden to do that. And however, they are saying that even if President Biden is not attending, it doesn't mean that the United States is absent from the talks. They are saying that they support the discussion, and they said that they have been actively engaged in the discussions.
Right. And now I'd like to ask you about the big news we heard yesterday concerning the use of the US-produced weapons inside Russia. So how is this decision commented upon in the US?
So essentially, this was something that Ukraine had lobbied for, for months, and then also other European allies who are especially concerned with the movements, with the advances that Moscow is moving into Kharkiv, where Ukraine is basically saying, look, you have to let us use these US-provided weapons to hit inside Russian targets. And the concern previously by President Biden is a concern of escalation. He does not want to allow Ukraine to hit Russian targets, especially deep inside Russia, with American-made weapons, because it would really open up the possibilities of escalation. And so he has been against that until this week. We've begun to hear about this around 2 days ago. And finally, yesterday, some senior administration officials have told me on background that, yes, President Biden has agreed to this. And today in Prague, Secretary Antony Blinken confirmed this change in U.S. policy. What's also interesting is that when Secretary Blinken was asked whether the U.S. would consider applying this change of policy in other regions, areas of the war, not just Kharkiv, which is just a very short distance from the Russian border, just 30 kilometers, would the U.S. consider doing the same thing in other regions? Secretary Blinken left open that possibility and basically just said the approach that the U.S. has had throughout this war is to be evolving and agile and adapting to situations on the ground. And so that really just leaves the possibility depending on the Russian offensive and how Ukraine is holding up against them.
So pardon me, let me just follow up on this question, because that puzzles me. What do you think made Joe Biden change his mind so quickly?
So I don't think it's quickly. I think it's been a period of months. There's been, increased pressure both from Ukraine, from European allies, and also American lawmakers were concerned about the offensive that Russia is building closer and closer. So, again, this is a number of things, a number of considerations. And of course, Biden is very carefully weighing the possibilities. He is already involved very deeply in terms of supporting Ukraine in the war. We just gave out $61 billion of supplemental funding for Ukraine. President Joe Biden is also involved in supporting Israel in its war against Hamas. So, the last thing that President Biden wants is something to escalate even further. So this was a topic or a decision that he did not take lightly.
So how do you think this will play with American voters? Will they see President Biden and, in his mind, hopefully, the next president as a strong man with an oversight of all of the world? Or do they see him as somebody who should really concentrate on his own backyard rather than getting America's spread thin around the globe?
So Joe Biden really ran on a campaign in 2020 as ending forever wars. He really campaigned on somebody who knows a lot about foreign policy, somebody who can be the adult in the room when it comes to foreign policy. Having said that, the track record of the past 3 years with the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and then the increasing involvement in Ukraine and now the war in Gaza, there's really not a lot of foreign policy achievement that Joe Biden can sell to the American electorate at this point for the election in November. So right now, what the White House and the Biden campaign is trying to do is really to pivot to domestic issues, which is, of course, in most cases, in most elections, in most countries, I would say, is the thing that people care about the most. The pocketbook issues in terms of the economy, the inflation rate, unemployment, immigration, crimes, and those kind of, domestic issues, including abortion. The right to abortion is really a big deal here in the U.S., particularly among women. So, all of these issues is something that Biden wants to focus on. He almost makes it almost seems that he really does not put a lot of emphasis on Ukraine, particularly after the passage of the supplemental package that I've just mentioned. It is a little bit different when it comes to Gaza, because it really cannot be ignored. I mean, just about before I came on to speak with you about half an hour earlier, President Biden spoke about the ceasefire deal that he is urging Hamas to take, that Israel has put on the table. This three-phase deal that he said would lead to a permanent ceasefire. So all of these foreign policy issues is complicating Joe Biden in his re-election bid in November. The polls suggest that the American public does not trust him in terms of foreign policy. And so we'll see where he goes with this within the next 5 months, particularly if, there's no end in sight in terms of a ceasefire in Ukraine or in Gaza.
So from what you said, American voters are not as concerned as we are here in Europe with Ukraine. It's Gaza that's on the forefront if they are interested in the foreign policy at all. It's Gaza that they're mostly concerned with. So how did the electorate feel about the use of American weapons in Gaza?
It's not really top of mind. I mean, the issue of Ukraine, yes, obviously there's a percentage of people who follow the news and journalists like myself, politicians who follow this closely, but there's a certain sense of fatigue among the American population. I mean, this is a war that is nearing 2.5 years now. There's a lot of questions from the American public in terms of how much money do we have to support Ukraine and what is the purpose. So this whole narrative that President Biden is trying to continue to remind the American people that this is to uphold democracy. This is to ensure that Putin doesn't expand his ambition across other parts of Europe, particularly NATO, which would drag the United States back into a war, having to send American boots into a war that nobody wants. So this is something that President Biden is selling. I'm not sure if the American people are buying it. So in terms of Ukraine, it's receding from people's minds, even though, again, President Biden is trying to make sure that there is still support, and particularly from Republicans in Congress, supporters of President Donald Trump, who say that, why are we providing all these $1 billion of U.S. taxpayers' money to Ukraine? In terms of Gaza, there's a different angle to this, because obviously with 36,000 people, Palestinian killed in Gaza within the 8 months of the conflict, there's a lot of sympathy from particularly progressives in the Democratic Party, Biden's own party, as well as Arab and Muslim Americans who are just outraged at the fact that, President Biden is so supportive of Israel, despite the fact that there is heavy civilian casualties, there's a lack of humanitarian aid going into them. So these are sort of two different foreign policy issues that American people are looking at it in different lenses. I think there's particularly particularly among young people, young Americans, there's a tendency or there's a narrative that they look at the issue of Gaza the same way that they look at other global injustices, movements such as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. They see this in the same context as the Palestinian cause, which is not necessarily something that they identify as closely with Ukraine.
Right. You said that Americans are not particularly happy with Joe Biden's foreign policy, but do they put any more faith in Donald Trump's abilities in this regard?
That's really interesting. So, I mean, in a way, both of these candidates are incumbents, right? I mean, President Biden obviously is running on his track record, and then President Trump is also saying that he ran on his track record. From the Trump campaign, what they're saying is that, while I was president, none of these craziness, none of this chaos is happening. We had peace in the Middle East. We had peace in Europe. I mean, the thing that the Trump campaign would try to underscore is that, Vladimir Putin or Hamas would never dare to do anything like this under President Trump. And of course, we hear President Trump says things like, if he were president, then he would solve the issue of the Middle East. He would solve the Russia-Ukraine conflict within 24 hours. This is something, obviously, that's very classic Trump in terms of the style that he speaks. In whether they trust Biden or Trump in terms of foreign policy, the polling is also very mixed. They're not happy with President Biden, but they are also not particularly enthused about the approach of President Trump. And this is particularly problematic for American Muslims and Arab Americans who are really so angry and so disillusioned by the approach that Biden has taken. But they also know that if they don't choose Biden, then the alternative is Trump, which may not be better, not only in terms of its Middle East policy, U.S. Middle East policy, but also its Trump's treatment of American Muslims. For example, we hear all these travel bans against people from Muslim countries while Trump was president, and so on. So it's a difficult choice for American voters between Biden and Trump in terms of foreign policy.
Well, Ms. Widakuswara, lastly, do you think you could touch briefly on the perception of Vladimir Putin? You did say how American public is seeing foreign policy, but what about this character who is seen in a very black light here in Central and Eastern Europe?
So, broadly speaking, the polls suggest that there is definitely more antipathy. There's more negative view towards Vladimir Putin from liberals and from Democrats, for example. And this is, kind of like a new trend or new narrative, maybe just the past couple of years. And Republicans in Congress also have sort of shown a narrative that there's not too many things wrong with Vladimir Putin. I mean, specifically in terms of his invasion of Ukraine and among other things. So this is a really interesting phenomenon that's happening in the U.S. I would say again that broadly speaking, Americans really don't care that much about the rest of the world. The Americans are very insular, are very inward focused. But certainly if you look at the polls, there's a difference in terms of how Republicans and conservatives versus Democrats and liberals view Russia, view China, view Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. This kind of strongman image perhaps is more acceptable to certain populations, certain areas of the electorate.
Well, thank you, Ms. Widakuswara. That was very enlightening to have your perspective on the issue.
My pleasure. Thank you.